Chapter 1593. Anlin. Anlin. Don't go. She clenched her fists tightly, but her left hand didn't move at all. It just hung there, lifeless. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead, and slowly, it became as big as a bean. Chin Anlin wrung a hot towel to help her wipe the sweat off her forehead, but she was getting hotter and hotter, and the sweat was increasing. She was running a fever. Dr. May came in with a serious expression. Anlin, she should have taken antibiotics after the surgery, but the child in her belly is only 6 months old. Now, what do you think? Chin Anlin pressed his hand on her body, and without hesitation, he said, let her use it. Dr. May wanted to talk to him about the consequences of using the antibiotics, but he interrupted her just as she opened her mouth. His voice was low, and there was a hint of forbearance in it. I said use it. Dr. May sighed. I'll inform the doctor. But she had only taken 2 steps when a weak voice came from behind her. No. Dr. May turned around. Yi Liangqiu hadn't woken up, but she grabbed onto Chin Anlin's arm forcefully with one hand. She shouted unconsciously, Don't. Don't. Dr. May's eyes reddened, and she looked at Chin Anlin again. His hand held onto Yi Liangqiu's hand tightly, and he said slowly, Why are you so stubborn? He turned his head and looked at Dr. May. As long as she gets through tonight, there won't be a problem. The premise is that her body temperature can't go over 38.5 degrees. Otherwise, it will still affect the fetus, Dr. May said immediately. Chin Anlin closed his eyes. Then let's wait a little longer. Dr. May knew how difficult it was for him to make this decision, so she turned around and said, Let's lower the temperature outside the body. She helped him take off the hospital gown. Chin Anlin used warm water to wipe her body over and over again. When he rubbed her little belly, he couldn't help but reach out to touch their child. The child was also gently moving inside, slowly wriggling against his palm. Chin Anlin's facial muscles were trembling. This was their child. Right now, it must also be feeling uneasy and uncomfortable. His palm slowly pacified the child. As if he could feel it, the little guy first swam a little, then kicked a little, and then a little. He looked very happy. If it was in the past, it would be an extremely joyous thing, but now, Chin Anlin couldn't help but bend down and kiss that little belly. Liangqiu, if this is what you want, then I will fulfill your wish. He had nearly killed her and their child. Liangqiu, if you want to go back to the Su family, then go back. I won't stop you. There was a tear in his eyes that dripped down, scalding the little guy. The little thing that was playing in his stomach froze for a moment before sucking his little finger. It seemed like Daddy was crying. Why is Daddy crying? The other little guy ran over and also poked the top. Then the 2 little ones hugged each other. I'm so tired, let's go to sleep. She fell asleep with her head resting on his shoulder. Chin Anlin couldn't feel the fetal movement, so he looked up at Dr. May. Dr. May knew what he was thinking. The child is asleep. It's good that she's asleep. She won't feel uncomfortable when she's asleep. He carefully covered Yi Liangqiu with a thin quilt. Just like that, he wiped her every half an hour for a day and a night. Her body temperature rose to 38 degrees Celsius, but it was under control. Dr. May stayed with her for 10 days. After all, she was old, so she fell asleep on the sofa in the middle of the night. At dawn, Yi Liangqiu's fever finally subsided. Chapter 1594. Chin Anlin sat by the bed and looked at the person on the bed quietly. She was sleeping very deeply and quietly, just like how she used to be. However, she would occasionally furrow her brows as though she was in pain. His fingers caressed her face gently, and his voice was deep and pained. Liangqiu, I hope that you will wake up, but at the same time, I hope that you will sleep like this. This way, you won't leave and won't go against me. When Liangqiu woke up, it was already 10 in the morning. She opened her eyes, feeling a little sore. At first, there was a white fog, and then her vision started to clear up. She was lying on the pillow, and her hand was slowly regaining its feeling and the pain. However, she was still lying there, looking at him and moving her lips. Although her voice was very soft, he still heard the two words, Anlin. Qin Anlin's eyes were a little warm. After a while, he asked mildly, "Does it hurt?" Her hand moved gently and she nodded her head. However, she couldn't bear to look away and kept looking at him. Qin Anlin pursed his lips. "I'll call the doctor." With that said, he got up. However, when he took a step forward, his hand was caught. After a long time, he looked down at the hand that was holding him. "Liangqiu, this is your own choice." Although he said those heartless words, his voice was trembling slightly. She didn't let go of his hand and held it stubbornly for a long while. Perhaps it was because the more vulnerable she was, the more she needed him. She told herself that this was it. Just let her hold it for a while more. Just a while more. In the end, he still turned around and looked at her face. She still looked at him and looked at his face, not saying a word. He said softly, "I'll watch over you, until you get discharged. But Liangqiu, I can only watch over you until then." His gaze was a little gentle, but it was the kind of gentleness that she hadn't seen in a long time, and it broke her heart. It was because he had personally pierced through her hand, and that was how he got that little bit of gentleness. She closed her eyes and didn't say a word for a long time. Qin Anlin stared at her for a while. Finally, he gently withdrew his hand and walked to the door. After calling the doctor, he didn't go in himself. Instead, he smoked a cigarette in the hallway. He needed to calm down so that his heart wouldn't soften. He wouldn't think about forgiving her, and he wouldn't think about getting back together with her. From afar, Kaim came over and stood beside Qin Anlin. He lit a cigarette for himself and pinched the butt before taking a puff. He paused and looked at Qin Anlin. "President Qin, I'm sorry. It was because he didn't keep an eye on Liangqiu, which was why things had turned out this way." Kaim blamed herself in her heart. Qin Anlin took a drag on his cigarette. "It's none of your business." Once she decided to do something, no one could stop her. Kaim wanted to ask more questions, but Qin Anlin had already put out his cigarette and walked to the ward. Kaim knew in his heart that President Qin still minded it more or less. He scolded himself in his heart. "Fuck, I can't even take care of a pregnant woman." When Qin Anlin returned to the ward, the surgeon and Dr. May were in the middle of a consultation. After confirming that the child was fine, the surgeon asked Liangqiu to try moving her left hand. But she couldn't move it. She might not have recovered yet. "Wait a little longer. Don't move and listen to my instructions," the doctor said calmly. Chapter 1595. Liangqiu was the dream girl for men her age. He remembered how beautiful her hand was on the movie screen. Now, it might be destroyed. The doctor felt that it was a pity, but he still followed the procedure. It would be best if he could save it, but if he couldn't, it would be crippled, and the hand would become a decoration. In fact, the consequences were far worse. The muscles of the hand would shrink in the future. He thought of Venus. The doctor left. Liangqiu lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, not saying a word. The ward was quiet. There was no one else but the two of them. "I'll find the best doctors," Qin Anlin said, "American, Swiss. They'll definitely cure your hand." He told himself that he was responsible for it. He was the one who pierced it, so he had to take responsibility. But he never dared to think too deeply. His heart ached. He ached for her. If she lost a hand, what would her life be like in the future? Liangqiu, I'd rather fix you up with my own hands and let you stand in front of me in one piece as my enemy. As for the future, I really didn't think about it. Just thinking about it made me unable to accept what I did to you, and I couldn't accept that you would be hurt. I've said that you won. It wasn't because I let my emotions get the better of me, but because I couldn't accept it. In fact, I've already come to terms with you. If not, I would have taken the opportunity to shoot Su Shiqing yesterday. He came to terms with her well-being as his #1 priority. It was just that he was unwilling to tell her these things. He could only bury it in the deepest part of his heart, savoring the bitterness in it. Yi Liangqiu said softly, "Thank you. Thank you." Qin Yi smiled bitterly. Since when had they become so distant with each other? Actually, it had been a few months since they had been separated. He had sent her to the detention center and pierced her palm. He thought that she must hate him in her heart. At this moment, Khan knocked on the door and came in with a moisturizer bottle. "I made this myself." His voice was a little hoarse. He probably hadn't slept the whole night. Qin Anlin took it and closed the door. Kaim's nose almost hit the door. He touched his nose and fished out another cigarette. Actually, when he was cooking the porridge, he was thinking, how nice it would be if Su Cheng lived here. Su Cheng was pregnant, and she was the kind of girl who was extremely picky. Now that she was alone in there, could she eat it all? Was the child in her stomach nourished enough? He really fucking wanted to see her. He really wanted to, but he resisted the urge. Since he had seen it, he probably couldn't bear to part with it. Inside the door, Qin Anlin looked at Yi Liangqiu for a while and said lightly, "Have some porridge." Kaim made it. Hearing Kaim's name, Yi Liangqiu finally calmed down. Her eyes met his. "How is he?" "Fortunately, I won't die. With a mild concussion, you can still be a father." His tone was a little harsh. Yi Liangqiu shut her mouth again. Qin Anlin helped her shake the bed a little more and pulled a chair over to sit. His movements were a little stiff as he scooped up a small bowl of porridge. It was just porridge, nothing else. "Just make do with it." He continued to be mean. "I think what you eat in there isn't even as good as this." She looked at his slightly awkward expression and lowered her eyes. "It's still better than this." Qin Anlin glared at her. "Yi Liangqiu, we are enemies now." "I just want to eat better," she said softly, feeling a little aggrieved. Chapter 1596. Qin Anlin looked at her quietly for a long time before he finally smiled lightly. He dialed a number to go out, and she kept looking at him. There was some greed in her gaze, for the last bit of tenderness he had. She knew that she was being shameless. Even now, she still wanted him to treat her well. She was undoubtedly relying on the child in her stomach. Qin Anlin put down the phone in his hand and looked at her deeply. Later. Then there was a moment of silence between the two of them. It was a deathly silence, as if there was nothing more to say. Anything she said would be wrong. He sat on the sofa, seemingly dealing with emails on his phone, while she lay on the sofa, looking up at a 45-degree angle. Fortunately, in less than half an hour, there was a knock on the door. A 5-star chef was standing outside, and behind him were 2 waiters who pushed a dining cart in. "President Qin, these are the nutritious meals you ordered. There are a total of 8 flavors, and they are all light, nutritious, and easy to digest. We will continue to serve you in the afternoon." The chef nodded. "I wish you a pleasant meal." Qin Anlin nodded. After closing the door, he opened the silver lids on the dining cart one by one and asked casually, "What do you want to eat?" Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "There's no need to be so troublesome." His gaze landed on her face for a long time before he said softly, "It's not troublesome. If you want me to do it, it will be troublesome." She quickly realized what he meant. Her expression was a little awkward, but she did not say anything else. He was right. If she wanted him to do it again, it would be troublesome. But now, he could solve it with money, and it was not troublesome. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and lay down, allowing him to feed her. He was very patient, feeding her small mouthfuls at a leisurely pace, as if this action could last until the end of time. As Yi Liangqiu ate, his gaze fell on his handsome face. Being able to take a look meant that he was able to take a look. After a long time, she was finally done. Qin Anlin put it away and did not touch the rest, asking the nurse to clean it up. "Aren't you going to eat?" Her voice was soft. Qin Anlin tilted his head and glanced at her. "Miss Yi, you don't need to care about me, just care more about yourself." With just one sentence, her worries and good intentions had been brushed away in an awkward manner. She was not angry. It was only right for him to be like this. It was already a great favor for him to take care of her now. Yi Liangqiu lay on the bed and looked up at the ceiling as usual. They were in an awkward silence again. Qin Anlin sat on the sofa and instinctively wanted to smoke, but in the end, he just clamped it between his fingers. After a long time, he looked up at her. "You don't seem worried about your hand." Yi Liangqiu was silent for a moment before saying, "There's no point in worrying." Compared to this hand, she had already lost something more precious. What she had to worry about was how to overthrow Su Shiqing in the future. Yes, if she protects the people she wants to protect. She was afraid, but he was with her for the time being. If he wasn't here, she would really be afraid. "Anlin, thank you for accompanying me." This sentence that she didn't say out loud made her nose sting. Qin Anlin did not ask her again. He had indeed done his best and even used Tang Yu's connections to invite a large number of foreign experts to come over for a consultation. The results were good but not bad, and it would depend on her recovery later on. Chapter 1597. Yi Liangqiu rejected it without a second thought. She wanted to give birth to the child properly. For a week, her hand was in pain. It was so painful that she couldn't sleep, and she would wake up from time to time at night. When she woke up, she would keep her eyes open until the sun rose. It was a life worse than death, but she continued to endure it. Qin Anlin accompanied her, watched over her, and took care of her. However, he didn't give her a hug. "Liangqiu, if this is your choice, then in the future, you have to get used to the days without me. Without my hugs, without my kisses, and without us being together every day." This wasn't a punishment. This was letting go. She woke up from the pain again. It was past 3 in the morning, and it was already the 10th day of her stay in the hospital. She opened her eyes. Under the dim yellow light, she was surrounded by white walls. Qin Anlin was leaning on the sofa in front of the bed, asleep. His chin was pale, and it seemed like he hadn't taken care of himself for the past few days. Yi Liangqiu looked at him quietly for a long time, then got off the bed and squatted in front of him. He had lost a lot of weight, and was even thinner than before. He had taken care of her for the past few days, but he hadn't eaten much. He must be feeling very sad. He hated her, but he had to take care of her. "Yi Liangqiu, because you were attached to his gentleness, you were actually cruel to him. It must be very torturous for him to be like this." She pursed her lips and smiled lightly. Her fingers carefully reached out and landed on his handsome brows, tracing the shape of his brows. He frowned, and as if he had sensed something, she immediately let go and held her breath. However, he didn't wake up, and only moved a little. After looking at him for a long time, she finally couldn't control her desire. She leaned forward and kissed him lightly on the lips. It was just a light touch, and she only felt his warm breath, but she left immediately after. She looked up at him deeply, as if she wanted to carve his entire person into her mind, deeply, deeply. Anlin, I have to go. If I stay any longer, it will be a form of harm to you. It will be a form of cruelty. When you see me, you will definitely think of your mother. You will definitely hate me and feel conflicted. I'm leaving. When we meet again, even if it's a bloodbath, even if you hate me to the core, we will have this moment of warmth in our lives. She got up, took the blanket, and gently covered him. She did not care about the tears that were dripping down her cheeks. She just let them fall. When the first ray of sunlight shone into the ward, Chin Anlin moved uncomfortably. His Adam's apple moved, and he slowly opened his eyes. Instinctively, he sat up and grabbed the blanket on his body. Then, he looked at the bed. There was no one there, it was empty. He began calling her name. He searched the bathroom, the kitchenette, the hospital room for her. His heart sank because she was gone. She was gone. Someone knocked on the door. Chin Anlin suddenly turned sideways, his heart beating wildly. He quickly walked over to open the door. But when he opened the door, a 5-star chef was standing outside. President Chin, today's breakfast. There was a defeated look on Chin Anlin's face. After a long time, he sighed softly. Leave it. The door closed. He looked at the sumptuous breakfast and smiled bitterly. He sat down and ate the breakfast that belonged to her bit by bit. As he ate, he looked up to stop his tears from falling. In the end, she still left. In the end, she still made the decision for him. She had always been more ruthless than him. When it was time to break up, she never hesitated. Chapter 1598. Kaim came over with a bouquet of flowers. When he saw the scene in the ward, he was stunned. She left. Don't mention her in the future. She's Su Shiqing's daughter. Chin Anlin clenched the fork in his hand. I'm going to flatten ATV. What Su Shiqing cared about the most was nothing more than his business empire. So, he would flatten ATV, press Su Shiqing's head against the door, and let him see the name of ATV change with his own eyes. Kaim was stunned for a long time. He stood there without saying a word. He had always thought that things would take a turn for the better, but in the end, they still left. Yi Liangqiu took a taxi back to the Su house. Su Shiqing seemed to have expected her to come back. He was sitting on the sofa looking at a photo album. When he heard the footsteps, he just looked up and said calmly, "You're back." However, his eyes still fell on her left hand. After looking at it for a while, he asked with concern, "How's your hand?" "It might be crippled." Yi Liangqiu's tone was even calmer than his, as if she didn't care. Su Shiqing focused all his attention on her. After a sound of acknowledgement, he got up, and Yi Liangqiu also noticed that the photo album he was looking at was a bit old. Although it was a long time ago, she could still see that it was a photo of Chin Anlin's mother when she was young. He raped someone, causing Lady Chin to commit suicide, and now he was still reminiscing about her affectionately. Suddenly, Yi Liangqiu wanted to vomit. Su Shiqing came over. "Raise your hand." "I can't. I need rehabilitation." Yi Liangqiu looked straight into his eyes. "Or if you think I'm a sacrificial pawn, you can kill me now." Su Shiqing felt a little embarrassed. He sighed softly. "Liangqiu, what are you saying? How can I bear to kill you?" Meeting her cold eyes, he flinched and then said, I used Mu Yun to threaten you last time because I was afraid that you would be soft-hearted towards Qin Anlin. I didn't really want to hurt Mu Yun. Think about it, he is my grandson. How could I bear to hurt him? Yi Liangqiu did not say anything. Su Shiqing sighed again. Even if I make a move, it will at most be a warning. It won't endanger his life. Really? Yi Liangqiu looked at him. You mean, if there's a next time, I won't listen to you because you're bluffing, right? Su Shiqing was embarrassed and annoyed. Liangqiu, this is not good for you. I hope we can keep our promise. Yi Liangqiu's voice was a little cold. Otherwise, I will do something 100 times more tragic than you can imagine. Su Shiqing was stunned for a moment, and then immediately said, of course. After a pause, he said, what you have to do now is to heal the injury on your hand. I need a decent heir. He could no longer host ATV now. Everything depended on Liangqiu. If her hand was not good and she did not have a healthy body, how could she convince the shareholders? It had to be said that Su Shiqing was an extremely utilitarian person. In his eyes, there was only profit. Even if he was dying, he could not change it. I will. Yi Liangqiu looked at him for a while, and then moved her eyes to the album on the table. Can you give this to me? Su Shiqing's body stiffened, and the muscles on his face were even stiffer. He coughed softly. What do you want this for? I miss it. Repent. Yi Liangqiu's voice was calm, but it pierced Su Shiqing's heart like a needle. Chapter 1599. Su Shiqing lowered his head. I'm sorry, Honka. He got her, but when he did that to her, she only felt pain and humiliation. Until death, she never liked him at all. Su Shiqing felt a little sad, but he was a person who looked forward. Yi Liangqiu sneered, it seems a little hypocritical to say sorry. There's really no need to do this. She picked up the album. Since you have done this, don't you feel disgusted looking at it every day? Su Shiqing was a little annoyed. What was this child saying? But he couldn't do anything about it. At this time, it seemed even more hypocritical to leave the album. He sighed, go and rest, the room is the same one as before. Yi Liangqiu held her belly and slowly went upstairs. She put the album on her bed. Mom, if you know in heaven, you will help me, right? A week later, Yi Liangqiu was sent to a private sanatorium in the United States to recuperate. For a whole 100 days, she stayed alone in the clean ward, thinking about her family in B City with the photos in her phone. After thinking hard, she opened her palm and looked at the bullet mark. There was already a scar there, so faint that it couldn't be seen clearly. She could move her hand, but every time she thought about it, her palm would twitch. She didn't know how many times she would wake up at night and find that she was in a foreign country, not in the sky of B City. Yi Liangqiu opened her eyes and breathed hard, swallowing the bitterness in her heart with every breath. She knew why she was sent to the United States. Because she was pregnant with twins, Su Shiqing didn't want to return both to Anlin. She didn't care, she would protect this child. Most twins were born prematurely. Near the new year, she gave birth to a pair of boy and girl. A boy and a girl, brother and sister. The brother named her Qin Mo, and the sister Yi Mu. When she fed the baby, she would look at Qin Mo more or less, because in the future, she might not see him again. However, Su Shiqing named Yi Mu to be sent to the Qin family, because the Su family needed a boy to carry on the family line. Yi Liangqiu didn't object, it was good for her sister to go back. Daddy would definitely dote on girls more. She sent the child's umbilical cord blood and Xiaoya Mu back to B City and froze them on a private plane. Mu Yun's illness would be cured. She only received a few words from Qin Anlin, saying that he had received Yimu. Then, there was nothing else. He should also know of Qin Mo's existence, right? However, he didn't ask. Yimu returned to B City and changed his name to Qin Mu, while Qin Mo changed his name to Su Mo. He became Su Shiqing's favorite grandson and the grandson he had placed his hopes on. Yi Liangqiu stayed in New York for almost half a year before returning to B City. At this time, the ATV was already in a precarious situation, leaving her with a mess. On the other hand, King Entertainment was on the rise, pressuring ATV until it couldn't even breathe. Su Shiqing didn't seem to care, only focusing on taking care of his grandson. However, he was also careful not to let his illness affect Su Mo. All day long, he was like a loving grandfather. What Yi Liangqiu didn't expect was that on the first day she went to work at ATV, she would meet Qin Anlin. At the shareholders' meeting, Su Shiqing announced that Yi Liangqiu would become the CEO of ATV, and no one had any objections. No matter how you looked at it, anyone would be better than Su Shiqing. Chapter 1600. After Su Shiqing's announcement, Yi Liangqiu officially took over ATV. Linda, the secretary that Su Shiqing had originally assigned to her, was still her secretary. Yi Liangqiu sat and took care of the mess that Su Shiqing had left behind. Su Shiqing was probably old and unable to do as he wished. Su Shiqing only said that ATV dominated the entertainment industry, but in fact, the company was in a mess. Yi Liangqiu looked at the company's report and frowned. She looked at Linda. Does Mr. Su know that ATV is already in a state of loss? Linda coughed lightly. Mr. Su doesn't ask much. He has high hopes for Mr. Yi. Yi Liangqiu looked at the numbers and sneered. He expects me to lay golden eggs for ATV. A messy company with low-quality artists. It was hard to believe that such a company was ATV, which was on par with King Entertainment. Linda heard her words and couldn't help but laugh. She covered her mouth and endured it. Mr. Su is unable to do as he wishes. Yi Liangqiu looked at her for a long time before asking lightly, "What's on the schedule in the afternoon?" Linda lowered her head, looked at it, and then said, "There's a meeting with the head of King Entertainment in the afternoon." Speaking of this, Linda seemed to be a little hesitant. She paused for a moment before asking, "Mr. Yi, do you need someone else to go?" Yi Liangqiu looked up at Linda and asked slowly, "Are you afraid that I'll feel uncomfortable seeing Qin Anlin?" Linda tacitly agreed. Yi Liangqiu smiled. "It's nothing." She had to show Su Shiqing her results. If she wanted to break through others in one fell swoop, she had to give him some benefits first, let him see hope, and let him think that she had already given in and accepted her fate. Linda was a little surprised. Did Mr. Yi really not care? Thinking about how they hadn't seen each other for more than half a year, what would it be like when they met? Linda was actually looking forward to it. There was really nothing that could stop a woman's heart of gossip. Yi Liangqiu gently flipped through the report in her hand, and her voice was very light. "Linda, you have been with Mr. Su for many years, right?" Linda immediately said, "About 7 or 8 years." As soon as she left school, she entered the ATV. It could be said that the ATV was her home. Although the current situation was not very good, she still could not bear to leave. "I think you also know very well that Mr. Su's illness may only be a matter of 2 or 3 years. Yi Liangqiu raised his eyes and looked straight into Linda's eyes. "Linda, you've been working for so many years. I'm sure you know the unspoken rules of the workplace better than I do. I don't think I need to tell you how important it is to take sides, right?" Her tone was neither light nor heavy, but it was enough to shock Linda. Linda was stunned. After a while, she murmured, "Mr. Yi." Yi Liangqiu looked at her. Of course, you can also choose to be loyal to Mr. Su, or you can be neutral, but the outcome of each choice is different. Think about it. Linda said directly without thinking, I'll be with Mr. Yi. Yi Liangqiu looked at her and smiled slightly. Think carefully. Su Shiqing is not that easy to fool. But Mr. Yi will have a way, right? Linda smiled. I've thought about it. ATV is like this now. If I don't make a living for myself, it seems like I'll be useless for the rest of my life. Yi Liangqiu looked up at her. It's good that you have a dream. In fact, Linda was betting that Su Shiqing would not live for long. Chapter 1601. She knew very well that she could only disintegrate Su Shiqing by his side. But she wouldn't tell Linda this. Go and prepare the information, she ordered lightly. Linda got a new master, nodded and left. When she went out, she still felt a little uneasy. Just then, her cell phone rang. She picked it up hesitantly, took a deep breath, and whispered, Mr. Su, nothing happened. It's quite normal. She hung up and went all the way back to her office. After entering, she saw a little rabbit on the table. It was a gift from Mr. Yi. It was quite cute, so she put it on the desk. Linda lowered her head and didn't notice that there was something special about the little rabbit's eyes. And this was a trick that Su Qing used to play. Yi Liangqiu found it in Su Cheng's room and gave it to Linda. From now on, she couldn't trust anyone. At 2:00 in the afternoon, Yi Liangqiu drove a white BMW by herself, and Linda was next to her. Linda looked at her hand holding the steering wheel and was a little worried. Mr. Yi, your hand. Are you okay? Why don't I drive? Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly. It's completely healed. But when she thought of Qin Anlin, she would still feel a faint throbbing pain. That place seemed to have a memory of him. Although it was painful, she could endure it. Linda replied with an "oh" and didn't say anything else. As Yi Liangqiu drove, Linda said, this time, ATV wants to buy the 40-episode TV series produced by King Entertainment. King Entertainment is asking for 300 million yuan for the package, but we haven't relented. It's a small investment of tens of millions, but it's asking for an exorbitant price. Moreover, the female lead is unknown. Mr. Su didn't think it was worth more than 150 million yuan. Although ATV was not doing well internally, its primetime TV series had always been doing well, and its advertisers were also top brands. As long as this was done well, ATV could at least survive for 5 years. Yi Liangqiu held the steering wheel and asked lightly, who are the main actors? Linda had prepared the documents, but she had not looked at them in detail. She had planned to talk about it in the car, and she could not make a decision immediately today. Linda took out the documents and said faintly, the female lead is played by a woman named Xia Mian. The male lead. Before she could finish, the car screeched to a stop. Linda was shocked. Mr. Yi. Yi Liangqiu paused for a long time without moving. After a long time, she softly said, say it again, who played the female lead? Linda looked at her cautiously. Xia Mian. Mr. Yi, is there anything wrong? Yi Liangqiu let out a long sigh. Go on. She stepped on the accelerator and got the car back on the road. Linda, on the other hand, was much more cautious. She was good at reading people's expressions, and she soon realized that Mr. Yi seemed to care about this female artist named Xia Mian. Although he didn't say anything, Mr. Yi was unhappy. Linda was a little depressed, and she didn't say anything after she finished speaking. Got it. Yi Liangqiu's voice was faint. After a long silence, she said, I know Xia Mian. Ah. Linda was stunned. Yi Liangqiu smiled gently. How could she not know her? When she and Qin Anlin got married, Xia Mian appeared in front of them like sticky candy, and every time she appeared, she would look delicate and pitiful. She was a real white lotus flower. However, she didn't know if Xia Mian had climbed into Qin Anlin's bed. Her heart was heavy, and she couldn't express her sadness. Chapter 1602. The white BMW was parked downstairs. Yi Liangqiu and Linda walked into room 1202, which had been booked in advance. The people from King Entertainment had already arrived. There were only Qin Anlin and Kaim. The small number of people surprised her. Yi Liangqiu stood by the door, her body stiff. After all, they hadn't seen each other for more than half a year. Her heart trembled slightly, and she didn't dare to look at him for a long time. Qin Anlin just stood up politely. He was thinner and thinner, and his whole body was full of alienation. Mr. Yi, he greeted indifferently, as if he was talking to a stranger. Yi Liangqiu lightly pursed her lips and lightly greeted him as well. She walked over and sat across from them. Linda carefully sat to the side. Qin Anlin lit a cigarette, took a drag, and asked, "You don't mind if I smoke, do you?" She looked at him and then at the dozen or so cigarette butts in the ashtray. Had he been here for a long time? Her voice was slightly stiff as she said, "If you mind, President Qin won't smoke. Mr. Yi always likes to tell the truth." Qin Anlin smiled faintly, but there wasn't the slightest hint of a smile in his eyes. Beside them, Kaim sighed inwardly. Why did they have to kill each other as soon as they met? They missed each other so much when they couldn't see each other. Su Shiqing was really shrewd. She hadn't seen him recently, and she couldn't find him even if she wanted to kill him. However, President Qin seemed to have let him go for now. He didn't do anything and just lived in peace. As Qin Anlin said this, Yi Liangqiu felt a fishy sweetness in her throat, and there was an indescribable feeling in her heart. Just then, the door opened, and a slender figure walked in. When Yi Liangqiu saw who it was, she was stunned. It turned out to be Xia Mian. And she also knew the person behind her. It was Ying Jia. Xia Mian probably didn't expect to see Yi Liangqiu either. She froze in place. She looked at Qin Anlin, and then at Yi Liangqiu, her lips pursed into a straight line. Kaim coughed lightly. "Mr. Yi of ATV, this time, your TV series is going to be aired in ATV's primetime slot." Xia Mian nodded, then smiled at Yi Liangqiu. "Thank you, Mr. Yi." It seemed that Xia Mian had learned a lot about the ways of the world in the past 6 months. If it were in the past, she wouldn't have been able to do this. Yi Liangqiu didn't speak to her. Instead, he greeted Sister Ying. "Long time no see. Let's have a meal together when you're free." Sister Ying was not bashful at all. She said straightforwardly, "Okay, let's make an appointment later." No matter what the current situation was, Yi Liangqiu was still the brightest star in her hands. Xia Mian was a little unhappy with Ying Jia's behavior. Ying Jia was her agent now, so how could she side with an outsider? So she said unhappily, "Ying Jia, we're going to Korea in 2 days, so we might not have time." Ying Jia was naturally unhappy with her insensible behavior. She was only her agent, not a nanny. Plus, Xia Mian hadn't grown up yet, and if she kept pressuring her like this, things would get out of hand in the future. Ying Jia hadn't been in the entertainment industry for so many years for nothing. She smiled faintly. "Little Yi can go with you." Yi Liangqiu could naturally tell that Ying Jia felt unfair for her, so she smiled and didn't say anything. Xia Mian was a little embarrassed, but in front of Qin Anlin, she didn't dare to act rashly. Qin Anlin put out the cigarette in his hand, looked at Yi Liangqiu quietly, and said in a businesslike manner, "Mr. Yi, let's talk about the contract." As he spoke, he lit another cigarette. Just as he was about to smoke, Xiao Mian coughed lightly. Qin Anlan's fingers paused, but he still put out the cigarette. Chapter 1603. Qin Anlan put out his cigarette. His gaze fell on Yi Liangqiu's face for a few seconds before he quietly looked away. He leaned back and looked at Keim. "Show the sample to Mr. Yi." Keim nodded. He got up and opened a file on his computer. He placed it next to Yi Liangqiu. "Mr. Yi, this is the first episode. All the samples are here. You can take a good look at them before you decide." At that moment, Xiao Mian sat where Keim had been sitting. She turned her body sideways and looked at it as well. This way, almost half of her body was pressed against Qin Anlan's arm. However, Qin Anlan didn't move away. He still sat there quietly, his gaze indifferent. Yi Liangqiu naturally saw it too. She could even see Xiao Mian leaning forward and revealing a little of her skin. Whether Qin Anlan did it intentionally or not, he could see it. She tried her best not to look at it. Instead, she focused on the sample in front of her. The beginning of the sample was quite beautiful. The female lead stood in a soft light and smiled at the camera. Then, there was a narration. "After so many years, I still haven't forgotten him." After watching it for a short while, Yi Liangqiu had to admit that Xiao Mian was a natural actress. She had a strong sense of the camera. The story after that was very youthful. It was about a young man and a woman in love. Xiao Mian was very young, so she easily got the role. She played the female lead in Summer Solstice, Midsummer. Yi Liangqiu watched it for about 20 minutes. Then, she watched the other episodes. They were well made and very good. She immediately decided to buy it. She smiled. "Why do you want to broadcast it on ATV?" Before Qin Anlan could speak, Xiao Mian was young and competitive. She spoke first. "We don't have to broadcast it on ATV. It's just that President Qin is still the same." Yi Liangqiu looked at her and then shifted her gaze to Qin Anlan. She asked calmly, "Does Miss Xia have any position in King Entertainment?" Qin Anlan looked at Xiao Mian and said, "Xiao Mian just expressed her opinion." Yi Liangqiu smiled. "Then we can't talk anymore, President Qin." She looked straight at him and said in a slightly domineering tone, "I'm not a person who will compromise." If the other party, a small artiste, dared to point fingers at her and be disrespectful, then she could forget about being Mr. Yi of ATV. As he spoke, he closed the laptop. "Goodbye, President Qin." Linda, who was at the side, was stunned. Boss has such a bad temper. However, she was a professional secretary, so she quickly packed up her things and left with Yi Liangqiu. As soon as she walked to the door, Qin Anlan's deep voice came from behind her, "Xiao Mian, apologize." "What?" Xiao Mian looked at Qin Anlan in disbelief. He actually wanted her to apologize. Did she do something wrong? Why did he want her to apologize? It was Yi Liangqiu who couldn't distinguish between work and threw a tantrum. Why was she the one to apologize in the end? She didn't want it. Qin Anlan said it again in a deep voice. This time, he was more strict. Xiao Mian was shocked, but she still apologized. She couldn't ruin everything she had worked hard for. Summer Solstice, Xiao Mian was the female lead in the audition. She had defeated thousands of girls to get this role. And this wasn't the original name of the show. In the end, one word was changed. Because her name was Xiao Mian, the scriptwriter changed it in the end. President Qin also agreed. She thought that President Qin's action was because he liked her, or at least it had some deeper meaning. Chapter 1604. She had worked hard for the show, and the director, screenwriter, and even the original author all said that she acted well. Why was it that when it came to Yi Liangqiu, it was worthless? She didn't want to give up her efforts, so she reluctantly apologized. "Mr. Yi, I'm sorry." Yi Liangqiu turned around and looked at her sharply. "Miss Ya, I think you know better than anyone else that ATV's primetime has made many actresses famous. No matter how bad ATV is, they won't beg to buy a newcomer's show." Her aura was so strong that Xia Mian was suppressed. Xia Mian didn't understand Yi Liangqiu's intention. Was this woman trying to suppress her? For a long time, Xia Mian said in a low voice, "I'll listen to President Qin's arrangements." She finally knew where she was wrong. However, from this incident and Xia Mian's reaction, she knew that she and Qin Anlin weren't that close. And Qin Anlin's action of putting out the cigarette seemed a bit deliberate. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and slowly walked back. She held the edge of the table with both hands and looked straight at Qin Anlin. "President Qin asked her to apologize, so she won't sell ATV. Is that what you mean?" Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes and played with the lighter in his hand with his slender fingers. "Mr. Yi is so sure." Yi Liangqiu grunted, 150 million, I won't add a single cent." Then she paused again. The decision to cooperate or not is in President Qin's hands. To be honest, 150 million is a cheap price for this production. But she's holding Xia Mian back, because all the major TV stations are busy showing spy dramas, and their schedules are full. They don't have time to show youth films. ATV's primetime has always been the first choice for youth films. She understood this fact, and Qin Anlin understood it even more. Only Xia Mian didn't know. Qin Anlin's fingers paused, and then he smiled faintly. "Okay." Obviously, Xia Mian couldn't accept it. One had to know that the investment for this drama was 100 million, and that did not include the actors' salaries. It was not profitable at all. In her eyes, Yi Liangqiu was a bloody steamed bun. She exclaimed, "President Qin." Qin Anlin gave her a stern look, and Xia Mian didn't dare to say anything. Ying Jia, who had been watching all this while, thought to herself that he was so petty and didn't know what was important. If President Qin didn't earn money to support her, she would feel that it was a loss. Now, Liangqiu was the one who felt bad in her heart. She seemed to have gotten a bargain, but she must be disappointed. In the past, President Qin had helped her like this. How could she not feel bad facing Xia Mian? Kaim handed over the contract. Yi Liangqiu read it once and asked Linda to read it again carefully. It took them about an hour to read the contract. Xia Mian was a little bored, so she sat on the sofa and played with her cell phone. Qin Anlin sat by the table, his expression impeccable, and his eyes fell on Yi Liangqiu's face and her hand. Her hand was very flexible. It was obvious that she had recovered. Just looking at her face made his Adam's apple move uncontrollably. He unbuttoned 2 buttons to hide it. Yi Liangqiu was unaware of all this. She just finished reading the contract and looked up. "Let's sign the contract of intent first." "What, Mr. Yi still wants to show off after getting a bargain?" Qin Anlin's voice was low and hoarse, and only he knew that when he looked at her, he couldn't control his body, which hadn't been excited for a long time. Chapter 1605. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. "President Qin, you're being too serious. It's never a bad thing to be careful." Qin Anlin looked at Kaim. Kaim immediately took out the initial document. "I'm ready." "Is it ready now?" Qin Anlin's voice was a little hoarse, and his eyes fell on her face coldly. Yi Liangqiu signed her name with a faint smile. Then, Qin Anlin also signed his name. After signing, Yi Liangqiu put away her contract and smiled. President Qin, it's been a pleasure working with you. Qin Anlin held her fingers and didn't let go for a long time. She struggled and looked at his face. President Qin. Qin Anlin suddenly let go of her hand, turned around, and walked out. When he let go of her hand, she clearly felt a sense of loss. The feeling of being let go was like yesterday. Xia Mian got up from the sofa and walked to the door. Suddenly, she turned around and looked at Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu, you left his life a long time ago. Why did you come back? She even showed a victorious look and left proudly. Yi Liangqiu looked down and chuckled. Ying Jia walked over and sighed. Don't argue with her. She's just a little girl. She paused for a moment. She likes President Qin, but there's nothing between President Qin and her. Don't think too much about it. There's no use thinking about it. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Ying Jia, thank you. Ying Jia didn't know what to say, so she had to make another appointment. Linda packed up her things and came over. She gathered up her courage. Mr. Yi, do you still love him? She was scared to death just now. The sparks between Mr. Yi and President Qin were too strong. It was like fireworks, full of sparks, and Xia Mian was like cannon fodder. Yi Liangqiu looked at Linda and smiled. Maybe. The two of them walked out together. Linda said as she walked, Mr. Yi is really amazing. We couldn't come to an agreement before. It's not that I'm powerful, it's that they want to sell it. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly, but her smile was somewhat bitter. 150 million yuan might seem like a loss, but if they made Xia Mian famous, the business value would be much more than that. When Qin Anlin promoted someone, he was always willing to spend a lot of money. Linda had seen it many times, so she immediately understood. She paused and said hesitantly, obviously, Xia Mian's EQ isn't high enough. It depends on how you package it. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and went to the car to open the door. Just as she was speaking, an arm suddenly pulled her back. Her body was pressed against the car, and in front of her was Qin Anlin's face. Beside her, Linda was stunned. She clenched the documents in her hands tightly. Was this a robbery? You go first. Qin Anlin squeezed out a few words. Linda looked at him in horror. What was he going to do to Mr. Yi? Was he going to kill him first? Holding the briefcase, Linda wanted to cry. She had just found a new master. If she ran away now, wouldn't she be going back on her word? Therefore, Linda boldly hit Qin Anlin with the briefcase. Let go of our Mr. Yi. Qin Anlin's body stiffened. With one hand pressing down on Yi Liangqiu, he turned his head and looked at Linda. How dare you hit me when you're so timid? What do you think I want to do? Qin Anlin's voice was deep. Up until now, Yi Liangqiu is still my wife. What do you think I want to do? Chapter 1606. There was no one around. Linda felt that if she fought like this, even with the help of Mr. Yi, they wouldn't be a match for this man. So, Linda backed down. She lifted her skirt and ran quickly. Mr. Yi, I'll go back to the company first. Yi Liangqiu looked at her back, and ran away with a whoosh. She felt a little helpless and turned her head to look at Qin Anlin in front of her. President Qin, do you want to catch up? Her body was pressed against the car door by him and she couldn't move, but she didn't struggle. They were very close, but their faces were 20 centimeters apart. Qin Anlin's eyes fell on her face. After looking at it for a long time, he said softly, You're willing to come back. Half a year ago, she asked someone to send little Chin Moo back, and she stayed in New York for half a year. At that time, he only knew that she was pregnant with twins, and they had a son named Su Mo Su searching surname. After saying that, he stared at her face, not letting go of any expression on her face. If I could, I also want to never come back. She smiled bitterly and finally pushed him away and stood up straight. If she didn't come back, she wouldn't have to suffer, and she wouldn't have to face everything. Su Mo looked very much like Anlin. Every time she saw Xiao Xiao's face, she couldn't help but think of Qin Anlin. Then why did you come back? He stood quietly, took out a cigarette, and lit it quietly. He looked at her. You don't want to see me, and you want to avoid me, don't you? Yi Liangqiu's gaze fell on his face. After a long time, she smiled. Qin Anlin, what if the current me is different from the previous me? She paused for a moment. Thousands of ATV employees have to eat. I didn't expect Mr. Yi to be so kind. Qin Anlin sneered. Don't you know that ATV is at the end of its road? Really? She smiled faintly. Then why is the drama Summer Solstice still being broadcast on ATV? ATV's bad situation was internally, and the ratings were not bad. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes and leaned to the side. Does Mr. Yi mind? His gaze was almost piercing as he looked at her. What do you mind? Yi Liangqiu smiled. Do you mind if you flatter Shemian? He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. Yi Liangqiu looked into the distance and then looked at him. If you need my signature one day, you can look for me. As soon as she finished speaking, her body was pressed down by him once more, his back hit the car door, and his bones hurt. Sign. He pressed her, his face close to hers. Yi Liangqiu, what do you want to sign? He deliberately hurt her. She could even hear the bones in her back cracking. Yi Liangqiu, as soon as you come back, you want to talk about divorce with me, don't you? He stared at her angrily. Don't you miss Mu Yun at all? Don't you miss Mumu at all? She was in so much pain that she closed her eyes. After a long time, she squeezed out a few words. Will you let me see him? He looked at her. It had been almost a year, but she hadn't changed at all. She was still as hateful as before. When he was angry, she could be so calm. He wondered if she had a heart. No. He sneered. Do you regret it? Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes. Qin Anlin, do you have to do this? If she knew him, she would know that this was already the most gentle way he could. Qin Anlin's gaze fell on her face. Just as he was about to say something, a weak voice came from behind him. President Qin, Kim asked me to come and call you. Chapter 1607. Qin Anlin tilted his head and looked at Xia Mian. Yi Liangqiu also opened her eyes. Her gaze fell on Qin Anlin's face and she smiled faintly. Yeah, President Qin's car is waiting for you. The air seemed to freeze. Qin Anlin's voice was deep. Get out. Xia Mian thought he was talking about Yi Liangqiu, so she smiled triumphantly. Yi Liangqiu pushed him away and wanted to open the car door. Did I allow you to leave? Suddenly, her wrist was grabbed, and she bumped into a Hun's chest. Her lips were kissed. She opened her eyes wide and looked at his enlarged face. Qin Anlin was angry. Rather than a kiss, it was more like a punishment. He kissed her lips fiercely and rubbed them. Her back bumped against the car door with a loud thud. He held her whole body in his arms. His fingers pinched her chin, and he took advantage of her weakness. She hadn't been kissed by him for a long time, so she wasn't used to it. Her head shook violently and she struggled. But he didn't let her go. He used brute force to hold her head in place and moved away slightly. His breathing was a bit messy. Yi Liangqiu, who allowed you to leave? He kissed her so fiercely that he almost bit off a layer of her skin. Xia Mian, who was beside them, was stunned. She just watched them entangle. She thought that President Qin treated her differently, but now she knew that there was no difference. Yi Liangqiu was the one who was different. Yi Liangqiu was the one who could irritate him and control his emotions. Xia Mian stared at them for a long time and finally left. Qin Anlin kissed for a full 5 minutes before he stopped. Both of them were breathless and looked a bit embarrassed. Yi Liangqiu turned her face away, not wanting to look at him. The lipstick on her lips was eaten by him. They were even slightly swollen, but they were redder than usual. Qin Anlin wasn't any better. His lips were peeled off several times. He looked up, took a step back and looked at her deeply. After a long time, he laughed at himself and said, "Mr. Yi, I've offended you." He took another 2 steps back and watched her fall against the car door. He remembered how beautiful she was when she was lying on his bed. Right now, even in this kind of place, in this kind of mess, she was still as beautiful as a painting. He was poisoned by her. He wanted to quit, but Liangqiu, he couldn't. My insomnia relapsed, but I didn't want to treat it, because I knew it couldn't be cured. Medicine has never been able to cure me. Qin Anlin left. Her body finally collapsed, and she slowly squatted down. Her legs were soft, her body was weak, and even her spirit was trembling. Her fingers slowly touched her swollen lips. His scent still lingered on them. The wild tension when he took her. After a long time, she finally got into the car. She wanted to drive, but her legs didn't have any strength. She opened her palm. There was a faint mark on it. It was very, very painful. Yi Liangqiu called Linda later, and Linda came over to take her back to ATV. After the relevant department of ATV saw the sample film, they were very optimistic about the film Summer Solstice, Summer Sleep, and wanted to schedule it immediately. Wait a little longer. Yi Liangqiu thought for a moment and said, "This won't be the only move King Entertainment is making. Xia Mian will definitely have other opportunities to be exposed." Linda hesitated for a moment. Mr. Yi wants to suppress this film. When Xia Mian's value is high, there will be a lot of advertisers coming to sponsor her. Chapter 1608. Linda looked at Yi Liangqiu with a creepy look. "Mr. Yi. You're so two-faced." Yi Liangqiu's reaction was indifferent. "Have you forgotten what I used to do?" Linda was stunned. Then she remembered that Yi Liangqiu was a pop queen. Xia Mian, a small star, couldn't compare to her. Years ago, at one of Yi Liangqiu's fan conferences, more than 10 people fainted, and one of them was even in a coma. She knew the rules of the entertainment industry better than anyone else. Linda asked worriedly, "Will King Entertainment be put in a difficult position?" Yi Liangqiu sat behind her desk and took a sip of the tonic she brought from home. Her voice was indifferent. "This isn't within King Entertainment's rights." She looked at Linda. "Qin Anlin isn't omnipotent. Go and find out what Xia Mian is doing recently. What films will she be showing?" Linda nodded. "Yes, Mr. Yi." Linda went to make a few calls. She knew people at King Entertainment. After making the calls, she came back. "Mr. Yi, I found it. In a month, Xia Mian will be watching a show at the Paris Fashion Show, and King Entertainment is talking about endorsements. She's talking about endorsements without even having any works. She's really trying to promote herself." Yi Liangqiu sneered. "She wants to ride on ATV. She's dreaming. Linda's eyes sparkled. Mr. Yi thinks far ahead. Yi Liangqiu looked down. She's signed a contract. Keep it a secret and don't show it for now. Linda nodded. Xiao Mian will definitely be popular, but it depends on how much ATV benefits from this. Yi Liangqiu clenched her fists, feeling the pain in her palms. After a while, she smiled. I'm going back first. Linda was suddenly interested. Are you going back to feed Momo? Yi Liangqiu smiled. He should break up too. However, this child was very clingy and refused to let go. Normally, she would go back early to feed him. Thinking of Momo, she thought of her other two children, Mu Yun and little Mumu. Yi Liangqiu was silent for a while before she smiled and stood up. Linda saw loneliness in her smile. She knew about the entanglement between Mr. Yi and Qin Anlin, but she didn't know why they separated. They were a good couple, but now they met, they were even worse than strangers. Moreover, looking at CEO Qin tonight, he was like a wolf. She didn't know if CEO Yi had been eaten. Linda didn't dare to ask and watched Yi Liangqiu walk out. When Yi Liangqiu drove back to the Su house, she played an episode of a recent popular drama, because of one person. Abandoning a city because of one person. I think I have found the balance of love. I am still me, as if I have never left. This city had trapped a lonely soul. Scars all over the ground were the proof of blood. That person opened the locked city gate. Melting the cold, accompanying me between heaven and earth, because of a city. Losing a person. At the end of love, no one wins. Infinite playback. There was a touch of moisture in her eyes. She didn't know when, but her face was already cold. She reached out and wiped it. It was actually tears. Yi Liangqiu, what's going on? Why do your legs feel weak when you think of him? You chose this path. Why did you become weak before you even started? There was a turn in front of her, and a car was coming this way. Her car had already deviated from her lane. She should have stepped on the brakes, but her legs were very weak. She could only watch the car crash towards her. Chapter 1609. Yi Liangqiu lay on her stomach for a long time before she opened her eyes. She looked out of the car window at the daytime. Her eyelids closed weakly and opened again. Finally, she fell into darkness. There was a commotion all around, and people surrounded her. The front of the white BMW was almost smashed, and the owner lay motionless on the steering wheel. Before the ambulance arrived, the reporters had arrived and were scrambling to report on the car accident. Soon, according to the license plate, the owner was Yi Liangqiu from ATV. Yi Liangqiu was not only a senior executive of ATV, but also a legend in the entertainment industry. Therefore, the financial section and entertainment section filled the pages for 2 days, and the news of Yi Liangqiu's car accident was everywhere. In the news, Yi Liangqiu was carried on a stretcher to the ambulance. Her hands were hanging, and her vital signs could not be seen. A large number of entertainment reporters followed behind, scrambling to report on it. Qin Anlin's face was livid as he looked at the scene in front of him gloomily. Kaim stood at the side, not daring to breathe loudly. There was a dead silence in the air. After a long time, Kaim asked carefully, President Qin, do you need me to go and take a look? No. Qin Anlin answered quickly. After a while, he picked up a cigarette and took 2 drags. Of course, he coughed violently. After a long time, he looked at Kaim and said, letting Jia go. Kaim nodded and went. Jia went to the hospital but did not see her. Yi Liangqiu did not have any external injuries. After a series of ultrasound and a series of CT scans, there were no problems inside or out, but she did not wake up. The doctor said that there was definitely a concussion, but she would not have been unconscious for so long. Jia waited until midnight and had to come back to report. Qin Anlin was still sitting in the president's office, and the cigarette butts in the ashtray on the table were piled up like a small hill. Jia pushed the door open and came in. She had worked for him for many years, so she spoke bluntly. "Why do you smoke so much?" Thus, he went in, opened the curtains, poured out the cigarette butts, and cleaned them up. Qin Anlin lit another cigarette. His voice was so hoarse that it was almost indiscernible. "How is she?" "He's not awake yet." Jia came over and snatched the cigarette from his hand. "That's nothing. If you care about her, go and take a look yourself. She's lying there half dead anyway. If you hesitate any longer, you might be able to attend the funeral tomorrow." Jia's words were quite vicious, but each word struck a chord in his heart. Qin Anlin looked up. Jia's back was facing the light, so he couldn't see the expression on her face. She continued, "President Qin, I missed someone. I always thought that he should be the one to speak first, but in the end, he didn't even say a word of love to me. That person was Kaim. The child that Su Qing gave birth to had been sent out. Kaim's mother liked the little girl very much. She hugged the little girl all day long and refused to let go. However, she still hadn't let go of the matter between Su Qing and Kaim. Kaim wasn't in a hurry. Jia had always known that Kaim had some tricks up his sleeves. Su Qing's performance was good, and her sentence had been reduced to 20 years. Perhaps it would be reduced in the future. Kaim continued to wait stubbornly. He introduced him to several teachers, but Kaim just met them. There was no future. Kaim continued to wait stubbornly, and she was also stubbornly watching, waiting to see when he would give up. Qin Anlin's eyes were a little bloodshot. In a sense, Jia was his bosom friend. Chapter 16:10. "But Jia, I'm different from you." He sighed. "I can do anything, but I can't get over my mother's matter." Jia could understand, but she believed in Yi Liangqiu's difficulties more. After a moment of silence, she said, "Just take it that she's Mumu and Mu Yun's mother. Let's go and have a look." Qin Anlin closed his eyes slightly, and his Adam's apple kept moving. After a long time, he sighed softly. "You go back first." Jia wanted to say something, but in the end, she didn't say it. She walked out of the door for him. She thought that the truth would come to light one day. She had raised Yi Liangqiu all the way, so she knew that child very well. Qin Anlin raised his hand and looked at his watch. It was already 1:00 in the night. He turned on the computer again and watched the news over and over again. He watched it like a masochist for about 10 times. He slammed his fingers on the laptop, picked up his coat, and walked to the door. When he opened the door, he saw Xia Mian squatting by the door. Seeing him come out, she raised her head. The expression on her face was a little stubborn, and there were stars in her eyes. She looked very much like Liangqiu 8 years ago. Qin Anlin was stunned for a moment. After a long time, he pursed his lips, ignored her, and walked straight to the elevator. Xia Mian chased after him and clasped his arm. "President Qin." Qin Anlin had already stepped into the elevator, and Xia Mian followed him. "Are you going to see Mr. Yi, President Qin?" There was impatience in Qin Anlin's eyes. After a long time, he suppressed his voice and said, "Miss Xia, you've crossed the line." Of course, Xia Mian knew that the reason why she was like this was that she looked a little like Yi Liangqiu. She clearly knew why President Qin took her there today. It was just to stimulate Yi Liangqiu. And she had been waiting for a chance to replace Yi Liangqiu. Not only did she have to replace Yi Liangqiu in the entertainment industry, she also had to replace her identity at King Entertainment. President Qin, I'm just worried about you. Xia Mian pursed her pretty lips. Dressed in a white dress, she looked like the heroine in a movie called The Most Beautiful Girl in School. I don't need your concern. Qin Anlan's voice was deep. Don't challenge my patience again and again, or you will know the consequences. Xia Mian sneered inwardly. Had he not thought, when he was using her, that he was giving her hope? The elevator door opened, and Qin Anlan walked out. Xia Mian paused for a long time before following him out. Qin Anlan sat in the car and started the car, but it didn't start for a long time. He slammed his hand on the steering wheel, and a sharp sound rang out. Then, all the cars in the parking lot screeched. He grabbed his hair in frustration, got out of the car, and walked to the side of the road to hail a taxi. It was late at night, and there was not a single car on the street. He was about to call the driver when a small white Shimei drove over. The window was rolled down, and Xia Mian's expression was cautious. President Qin, do you want me to drive you there? Qin Anlan looked at the empty street and finally got in the car. Xia Mian drove steadily, but her car was too small, and it seemed even smaller when he sat in it. While driving, Xia Mian looked at the rearview mirror and said softly, "My car is small, so it might not be comfortable." Qin Anlan ignored her. Xia Mian was rebuffed, so she didn't say anything else and drove to see City General Hospital. Chapter 1611. She didn't understand why President Qin still couldn't let go of that cruel woman after what had happened. He was still concerned about her life and death. Su Shiqing was useless, Yi Liangqiu was dead, and ATV would soon be finished. President Qin couldn't let go. After dealing with ATV, how would he deal with Yi Liangqiu in the end? Thinking of this, Xia Mian felt a chill in her heart. The answer couldn't be clearer. No matter what Yi Liangqiu did, as long as she didn't do anything to Lady Qin, Qin Anlan would forgive her. A gust of night wind blew, and Xia Mian suddenly felt very cold. She hugged herself and looked at the street lights of B City, feeling that she still had nothing. As for Yi Liangqiu, it seemed like she had lost everything, but in reality, it was just as Qin Anlan had said, she had always been his wife, and she had never changed. In the white corridor of the hospital, the sound of leather shoes stepping on the floor tiles was clearly heard in the dark. The nurse on duty was sleepy. She opened her eyes and looked at the handsome man in front of her. After a while, she became more energetic. "Sir, it's past visiting hours. Which room is Yi Liangqiu in? I want to see her." Qin Anlan's slender fingers were on the duty desk. The nurse looked at the Patek Perrier watch, and then looked at the handsome face that shone like a diamond. "Miss Yi is in the ICU. She can only be visited at 4:00 in the afternoon every day." She added, "She has to be her immediate family. I'm her husband." Qin Anlan's voice was low. "I want to see her now." The nurse looked at him for a long time, and then said hesitantly, "Doesn't look like her." But the next second, her mouth was wide open as she looked at the man in front of her. She remembered that Miss Ye's husband was President Qin of King Entertainment. So the man in front of her was President Qin. Oh my God, he was even more handsome than a male star. The nurse's eyes were immediately filled with stars. She held her hand and looked at the handsome man in front of her. Qin Anlan pursed his lips and pinched it again. Only then did the young nurse wake up. She coughed lightly and said, "He's not awake yet. I can only take a look." Qin Anlan's expression didn't look too good. The nurse immediately walked in front of him and muttered, "What the hell? You're the one who begged me. However, since he was handsome, she would let it go. The door opened, and it was very quiet inside. In the plain white ward, Yi Liangqiu was lying quietly with an oxygen mask on. It was so quiet that it did not seem to be alive. At that moment, Qin Anlin felt a stabbing pain in his heart. It was very, very painful. He slowly walked over to her and looked at her sleeping face. Yi Liangqiu, what is this? His voice was low and hoarse. Do you think I'll forgive you just like that? Do you think you can escape like this? As he spoke, his eyes were already filled with warmth. It was only now that he knew how painful it was to want to love someone but not be able to love her. He wanted to care for her, wanted to hug her but not be able to. He couldn't forgive her, but when she was in pain, he would be in more pain than her. He tortured her, provoked her, and watched her in pain. He thought that he would be happy, but the one who cared more was him. He bent down and whispered in her ear, "Don't you want to go against me? If you want to go against me, get up. Yi Liangqiu, get up." The pain in his chest was so unbearable that he was about to die. He knew that she was fine. She just didn't want to wake up. "Liangqiu, do you get tired too?" Chapter 16:12. Suddenly, a black barrel of a gun was pressed against his forehead. Qin Anlin's entire body tensed up. He narrowed his eyes, but he didn't move. He believed that as long as he moved, the gun with a silencer would shoot through his head. "Anlin, you didn't think that you would end up like this, did you?" An old voice rang out. Then, Su Shiqing appeared out of nowhere and stood by the side of the bed. Qin Anlin looked up and slowly straightened his body. Naturally, the gun moved with him. But Qin Anlin was 186 centimeters tall, while the little killer was only 172 centimeters tall. It was very strenuous for him to stand on his tiptoes. They hadn't seen each other for a long time. Su Shiqing looked a lot thinner and older. He was in his early 50s. He used to be in high spirits, but now he looked like an old man. Qin Anlin's lips curled into a cold smile. "Su Shiqing, how much longer are you going to make use of her?" Even when his life was at stake, he still wanted to make use of her. "Anlin, this is the fundamental difference between you and me." Su Shiqing licked his lips. People who want to achieve great things have to cut off all emotions. Otherwise, if you have a weakness like yours, you will be easily killed. Su Shiqing's voice became cold. "And if I kill you now, no one will know that the nurse outside has fallen asleep again." Qin Anlin stared at Yi Liangqiu's face for a long time before saying softly, "Is that so?" At this moment, Yi Liangqiu's eyes slowly opened. She looked at Qin Anlin quietly and the black barrel of a gun in his forehead. Su Shiqing didn't notice that she had woken up. He was still smiling coldly. Of course. If he killed Qin Anlin, Liangqiu would be the biggest beneficiary of King Entertainment's shares. And now that Liangqiu was unconscious, it was his best opportunity. Su Shiqing raised his hand gently. "Don't dirty the bed sheets." He didn't want Liangqiu to be frightened when she woke up. He still treasured this daughter of his. It could bring him everything, and it could bring him supreme glory. However, the killer did not move for a long time, and his voice trembled. "Mr. Su, eldest miss is awake." Su Shiqing squinted and looked at the bed in disbelief. Yi Liangqiu lay there quietly, looking straight at Su Shiqing. They had an agreement. But Su Shiqing had violated it. Under such a gaze, Su Shiqing was a bit embarrassed. He coughed lightly. "I'm protecting you. I'm afraid he'll do something bad to you." The moment he said that, the atmosphere became a little awkward, because he had indeed done something improper to her today. Qin Anlan's eyes fell deeply on Yi Liangqiu's face, and his tone was calm and slow. She is still my wife. Even if she does something wrong, it can't be said to be improper, right, Mr. Su? Su Shiqing couldn't get out of this embarrassing situation and could only chuckle. You can say so. Yi Liangqiu lay there, and her lips moved slightly. Her lips were very dry. She had a dream just now. It was a very long dream. There was Anlan, Muyun, Mumu, and Momo. They were living together. The dream was very beautiful, so she didn't want to wake up. However, a voice pulled her back, and she opened her eyes with difficulty. Her Anlan was right in front of her. Su Shiqing was also in front of her. So she knew that she had woken up because he was in danger. I want to say a few words to him. Yi Liangqiu turned her face and looked at Su Shiqing. Su Shiqing was embarrassed at this moment, because he had broken his promise to her. Chapter 16:13. Su Shiqing smiled lovingly. Then Dad will come and see you tomorrow. Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything as she watched him walk out. Qin Anlan was still standing there, looking straight at her. Why did you help me? He laughed self-deprecatingly. Everything will be solved if I die, including the child. Yi Liangqiu's gaze fell on his face, and her gaze was a little listless. Slowly, she closed her eyes and sighed. Anlan. I'm a little tired. Her eyelids closed, and she actually fell asleep. Qin Anlan was surprised. He sat down to touch her forehead and pinched her, but she didn't wake up. She was stubbornly immersed in her own world. In the end, the doctor on duty was called over. The doctor was also very nervous. Firstly, it was because of Yi Liangqiu's identity, and secondly, it was because Qin Anlan seemed like he would blow up the hospital if anything happened. After a careful examination, the doctor finally heaved a sigh of relief. He got up and said to Qin Anlan, she's just tired and wants to sleep. Qin Anlan was stunned. He grabbed the doctor's arm and asked again in disbelief, she just wants to sleep. The doctor smiled. Yes. She just wants to sleep. Just as he was about to leave, he was caught again. Qin Anlan's voice was a little bitter. Will she wake up? The doctor pondered for a moment. At least until 8 or 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. He smiled. Looks like she can sleep a lot. 8 or 9 o'clock. After the doctor left, Qin Anlan was still thinking about these numbers. After a long time, he dimmed the lights. Under the dim light, she quietly slept. Her long black hair was scattered on the pillow. Just like on their wedding night, she also fell asleep like this. Qin Anlan didn't know how long it had been since he had a good sleep. With her here, he couldn't resist the temptation and slowly lay down beside her. He closed his eyes and fell asleep just like that. When the doctor made his ward rounds in the morning, he came over and saw two lying on the bed. This was the intensive care unit. What did a man want to do with a female patient in the middle of the night? The one on duty during the day was a female doctor. She immediately felt that this man was a beast. The nurse said that the patient's husband came to visit in the middle of the night, and he actually reached into the bed. The female doctor suddenly felt that this man was a pervert, and the one on the bed was not his wife. So he ordered the nurse beside him to call security. If this kind of thing was known by the higher-ups and the outside world, it would be terrible, and the hospital's reputation would be greatly damaged. The young nurse eagerly went to call them, and in less than 5 minutes, 4 security guards came in. Drag him out and find a place to lock him up. Let the higher-ups deal with him later. The female doctor frowned. After she finished speaking, the security guards were just about to step forward when Qin Anlan woke up. His whole body was a little uncomfortable. He was afraid that he would squash Yi Liangqiu, so he only slept about 50 meters. When he opened his eyes, he saw a female doctor with a beautiful face. He rubbed his forehead and lay back down. Just a moment ago, he thought he saw Tang Yu. The female version of Tang Yu. Don't think that you can pretend to be dead. The female doctor gritted her teeth. Pervert, let go of our female patient. It was not strange for her to have such thoughts. Yi Liangqiu was a celebrity, and many crazy fans would do anything. She also thought that this was one of the crazy fans. Qin Anlin pressed his fingers on his eyes and said slowly, "It seems that the handover work in your hospital is not good." Chapter 16-14. The female doctor was stunned. What did he mean by that? Qin Anlin said slowly, "I'm Yi Liangqiu's husband, Qin Anlin." He said it unwillingly. Why? Did he look particularly wretched? The female doctor took a deep breath and stared straight at the man on the hospital bed. There was a light green hue on his smooth and good-looking chin. His tall nose gave off an air of nobility, and the shape of his face was square and stylish. Nothing else could be seen. She looked at the security guards around her and couldn't make a decision. Just then, the hospital director ran over, wiped his cold sweat, and scolded the female doctor in a low voice. "What's going on? Why are you being so rude to Mr. Qin?" The female doctor had a strong background, and the director usually doted on her. But at this moment, the director interrupted her rudely. "Stop it. Mr. Qin is Mr. Ye's husband. Get out, what are you talking about?" The female doctor was stunned. Was it true? Qin Anlin was still lying on the bed, as if he didn't see or hear the director's voice. The director sent the security guards away, bent over, and said gently, "Mr. Qin, if there's anything, call the nurses outside. Dr. Li is young and inexperienced, so please forgive her." Qin Anlin grunted indifferently and didn't say anything else. Seeing this situation, the director left silently. He was a considerate person, and when he came, he knew that Yi Liangqiu had already woken up once, but she was just asleep. After he went out, he reprimanded the group of people again. Only then did he feel at ease. He also sent a few nurses to stand guard at the door to watch over them. After the security guards were cleaned up, Qin Anlin lay on the bed, and his fingers slowly moved away as he looked at the ceiling. After a long time, he said calmly, "I was treated as a pervert, so why didn't I wake up now?" Yi Liangqiu had been awake for a while, but she didn't get up, probably because she didn't want to face the fact that they were husband and wife. "I want to see how President Qin will deal with it." As Yi Liangqiu spoke, she turned her back to him and buried her face in the pillow. "Why are you sleeping here?" Annoyed that she had turned her back on him, he sat up and looked down at her. It would be a lie to say that he wasn't moved at all. After all, they had been husband and wife for so many years, although they didn't spend much time together. Her figure was of the finest quality, and even though she lay down in a thin gown, she was very attractive, even though it was simple. Half passionate and half angry, he suddenly lay back down and hugged her from behind, locking her body so that she could not escape. His voice was as tense as his body. Why did something happen? Yi Liangqiu looked down at his hand that was holding her. She didn't answer him directly. "Let go of me first." "I won't." Not only did he not let go, but his entire face was buried in her neck. His hot breath blew on the back of her neck, causing her to shiver uncomfortably. His voice was angry and unwilling. "Yi Liangqiu, if you think you can soften my heart by doing this, you're wrong." After a long time, Yi Liangqiu chuckled. "Why would I?" Qin Anlin's body froze. He stared fixedly at her head, and then lowered his head again. He used a lot of force to bite down on the flesh of her neck, so fiercely that it seemed like he wanted to bite off a piece of her flesh. She cried out in pain, and then let him bite her without making a sound. He didn't relax until he tasted a trace of blood. He stepped back a little and looked at the red mark. Chapter 16:15. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips tightly and did not say a word. Her forehead was covered in sweat. Yi Liangqiu, I thought you wouldn't be in pain, he said coldly. Suddenly, he turned her over and took advantage of the situation to get on top of her. He covered her with his hands and held her palms high up with their fingers interlocked. It looked like a very intimate gesture, but only she could feel how tense he was and how cold his expression was. Next time, don't play this kind of trick with me. He stared into her eyes. This time, she did not avoid it. She looked at him and chuckled softly. President Qin has been talking to himself all along. President Qin seems to be overthinking things. It's just a small accident, but President Qin has thought too much. She could not move her palms, so she lifted her body slightly and pressed her lips against his. Or President Qin still can't get over it. His gaze turned colder. At that moment, she was dressed in pure white, but she was also very charming. The more she looked like this, the more resentful he felt. He pinched her chin with one hand. Yi Liangqiu, you can be more shameless. The moment he let go, she suddenly reached out and hugged his neck. Her lips moved forward to block his body instantly froze. He looked at her coldly, but his body was honest. Her body was soft, as though it was boneless. He had tasted that feeling many times, but it had never been as eroding as it was now. The joy and happiness that was filled with hatred was actually so heart-wrenching and irresistible. Once it was out of control, he kissed her passionately on the hospital bed, pouring out his unknown longing and struggle. His beard pricked her lips. Her nails scratched his neck, but neither of them had the time to care. They just hugged and kissed like that, as though they wanted to suck every inch of air out of each other's bodies. His heart, lungs, and internal organs were all aching. But no matter how painful it was, it could not stop this kiss. It was really just for a moment. They took a breath, and their gazes intertwined. Her eyes seemed to be filled with water. So much love and hate were entangled with each other fiercely. Then, they kissed again. This time, he hugged her, held her, and stumbled. The heat was on the verge of exploding. Dr. Li heard the noise and brought a few nurses in for the patient's safety. They were all stunned by what they saw. That scene was too unbearable to watch. Dr. Li subconsciously looked around. Was this still the ICU? How good would it be if every patient was as lively as this? The young female doctor coughed. Mr. Qin, the patient shouldn't do strenuous exercise. If she didn't come in, he would probably go all the way. Qin Anlin was still holding Yi Liangqiu. His voice was full of impatience and hoarse. Get out. Dr. Li still wanted to say something, but the nurses dragged her out. The hospital director had instructed them not to let Dr. Li act recklessly. With everyone gone, the atmosphere was a little strange. Qin Anlin suddenly let go of the person in his arms, and his gaze lingered on her collarbone. Her hospital gown was unbuttoned. She adjusted her gown and smiled lightly. President Qin, you can leave now. He sat by the bed, so annoyed that he wanted to smoke. Then, he heard the sound of her changing and suddenly turned around. His eyes were bloodshot as he watched her calmly changing her gown with her back to him. Chapter 16:16. She suddenly turned around. Their eyes met and his voice was hoarse. I'll go first. He walked to the door slowly. He had slept well, but he still felt exhausted. When he reached the door, Yi Liangqiu suddenly said, Anlin, how have you been? He placed his hand on the door handle and lowered his head. After a while, he said, "That's it. Don't go easy on me." Her voice was anxious and there was a hint of unease in it. This time, he turned around and looked at her. "I won't." He opened the door and walked out. She was right. He was indeed thinking too highly of himself. Yi Liangqiu looked at the closed door but still buttoned up her clothes. She was going to be discharged now. Dr. Li came in and was a little surprised. He put his hand in the pocket of his white coat and said, "Miss Yi, you still need to stay in the hospital for 3 more days." "I'm fine," Yi Liangqiu said lightly and then looked at Linda who had rushed over. "Linda, I'll wait for you in the car. You can go through the discharge procedures." Linda nodded and then said worriedly, "Mr. Yi, you can't drive by yourself." "I know." Yi Liangqiu smiled and walked out. Linda stayed behind and fought with the female doctor. Half an hour later, she went out. Seeing Mr. Yi sitting obediently in the front passenger seat, Linda smiled in satisfaction and started the car. Yi Liangqiu said calmly, "Go back to the Su mansion. Su Shiqing should still be there." Linda tilted her head and looked at her for a while before stepping on the accelerator. The car drove to the Su mansion. Yi Liangqiu didn't get out immediately. She placed her hand on the door and said to Linda, "Go back to the company first. I'll go to work tomorrow." Linda was a little touched. She knew that Mr. Yi didn't want to drag her into the Su family's internal strife. Yi Liangqiu got out of the car. After Linda drove the car away, she slowly walked towards the Su mansion. Su Shiqing sat on the sofa in the living room and played with Silent Emo. He truly doted on Silent Emo. Yi Liangqiu approached slowly. Su Shiqing raised his eyes and looked at her for a while. He lowered his head and patted Silent's little head lovingly. He ordered the servants beside him, "Bring the young master upstairs to play." Little Momo was only half a year old, and it was the time for him to have fun. When he saw Yi Liangqiu, his eyes were filled with desire. He hadn't stopped breastfeeding yet. Yi Liangqiu wanted to take this opportunity to stop breastfeeding, so she didn't hug him. After the servant silently carried the little boy upstairs, Yi Liangqiu looked at Su Shiqing and sneered, "If there's a next time, I promise you, everything you've been waiting for will be in vain." Being threatened by his daughter like this, Su Shiqing lost his face and suddenly exploded. He dragged his broken leg and stood up. "What are you talking about? I am your father." Yi Liangqiu sneered. "But none of the things you did were things that a father should do." She continued, "You know the situation of ATV very well. It's very easy to make it close down." Su Shiqing's eyes were filled with viciousness. "Aren't you afraid that I'll take Qin Pei's life?" "I'm afraid. Of course I'm afraid." Yi Liangqiu walked in front of him and looked down at him. "It's because I'm afraid that I still listen to you." Her body had an oppressive aura, and even Su Shiqing was a little stunned. Yi Liangqiu bent down and looked at him. "If Qin Pei dies, I won't have the face to explain it to Anlan's mother." Then she whispered into his ear, "Dad, do you still dream of Honka's death every night?" Chapter 16-17. Su Shiqing's eyes were wide open. His old eyes were covered with layers of loose eyelids, and they didn't look as sharp as before. He opened his mouth slightly, and his lips moved as he said with difficulty, "Don't mention her." "Why not?" Yi Liangqiu looked up at him and smiled coldly. "Dad, will you still dream of Honka lying in a pool of blood?" Su Shiqing's fingers on his knees trembled. He raised them and pointed at her shakily. "Don't say it, don't say it." After saying it a few times, he muttered, "If you say it again, I'll kill Qin Pei." "Kill him." I'll be free if I kill him. Yi Liangqiu leaned close to his face and imitated Su Shiqing's voice. Dad, if you kill him, he'll go down and be Honka's wife again. Are you willing? Su Shiqing looked up and stared at her. Yi Liangqiu smiled coldly and straightened her body. If you're not afraid that Qin Anlin will point a gun at you again, it's better to find a place to hide and recuperate. Su Shiqing swallowed hard. This is my home. Yes, but you have to live in hiding like a shrinking tortoise. Yi Liangqiu's lips curled into a mocking smile. Su Shiqing was extremely unwilling, but he still called his men and was pushed away in his wheelchair. After he left, Yi Liangqiu finally relaxed completely. She sat on the sofa and leaned her head against the back of the sofa for a long time. She reached out to cover her eyes. Her eyes were a little hot. All she could see was Qin Anlin hugging her and asking her if it hurt. Anlin, how could it not hurt? If it wasn't for the fact that Su Shiqing's men were watching Mu Yun at the airport, I might have watched you kill him. I'd rather Qin Pei die. But after calming down, she still didn't regret her choice, even though it was a little painful. After pausing for a moment, she slowly walked upstairs. Little Momo had already learned how to lie down and was playing on the bed. She slightly rearranged the room that Su Qing used to live in and turned it into Silent's game room. Su Cheng's place had many little toys to begin with, so Silent couldn't be any happier. Yi Liangqiu felt a little dizzy, but she still played with him for a while. The little maid worriedly said, "Eldest miss, you should rest for a bit. You don't look too good. Get someone to prepare lunch." Yi Liangqiu lightly said, remembering that she had not eaten for almost 20 hours. The little maid immediately ran down to instruct the kitchen. Yi Liangqiu carried little Momo and raised him up high. Little Momo smiled at her. She also smiled and asked softly, "Momo, do you miss Daddy?" "Be good, Momo, and I'll take you to find Daddy." Yi Liangqiu pinched her son's little face. The little guy's body was especially strong, different from Mu Yun's delicate body in the past, so she didn't have to worry. Moreover, this child was cheerful, and when he smiled, there were two little dimples, very much like Anlin.O. It was probably because she pinched too much that the little guy was unwilling. He twisted around on her body and finally peed. Yi Liangqiu rested at home for a day before going to work at ATV. Linda followed behind and asked worriedly, "Mr. Yi, are you all right? Do you want to rest for a few more days?" "No need, I'm fine." Yi Liangqiu shook her head and sat down. "Is there any news from King Entertainment? Has there been a date to sign the contract?" Chapter 16-18. Yi Liangqiu interrupted her. There are so many platforms, and they can't stop her from becoming famous. It's better to maximize the benefits. Linda still didn't understand. Mr. Yi and Mr. Su were supposed to be enemies, so why did he still try his best to support ATV? When she asked cautiously, Yi Liangqiu looked at her for a long time before replying, "You'll know in the future." She still couldn't completely trust Linda, so she wouldn't tell her some things unless it was a critical moment. Linda nodded, "I understand, Mr. Yi." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly, "Go out first, I'll read some documents." Linda went out. Yi Liangqiu frowned slightly, looked at the documents in her hand, and then put them down. She flew to Hong Kong on Saturday and Sunday, and it was already 10:00 in the evening when she returned. In the dead of night, she took a car back from the airport. Along the way, there were billboards advertising the latest sanitary pads, and the spokesperson was the unknown Xia Mian. Sanitary pads. Yi Liangqiu smiled, it was a good match for her teen drama. Annoyed, she didn't want to see it anymore, so she rolled up the window. Xiao Zhang, the driver, said, "Mr. Yi, it's Mid-Autumn Festival in a few days. How are you going to celebrate with Mr. Su? In the eyes of outsiders, Su Shiqing was an old man, and Mr. Yi was having a hard time, taking care of Su Shiqing while working at the company. Mid-Autumn Festival. Only then did Yi Liangqiu remember that it was Mid-Autumn Festival again. So fast. She pursed her lips and remembered that it was her birthday in 2 days. Her last birthday was still vivid in her mind, and Anlin gave her the biggest surprise of her life. Every time she dreamed of it, she would wake up in tears. Xiao Zhang didn't notice what she was thinking and said, "Mr. Su will be happy." Yes. Yi Liangqiu smiled gently. Then she looked up at Xia Mian's billboard, feeling it was a bit dazzling. Just then, her cell phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and didn't want to answer it, because it was from Qin Anlin. The phone rang again and again. Xiao Zhang wondered, "Mr. Yi, phone." Yi Liangqiu handed the phone to him. "Tell him I'm home and I left my phone in the car." Little Zhang was young and quick-witted. Furthermore, how could he not know the caller ID? Thus, he picked up the call. His voice was calm and natural. "President Qin, right?" President Ye's phone was left in the car. "Right, President Yi is already home." With that, he hung up. Little Zhang returned the phone to Yi Liangqiu, not daring to ask any more questions. Yi Liangqiu didn't say much. He leaned against the back of the chair and whispered, "Turn down the air conditioner. I want to sleep for a while." Xiao Zhang, and Xiao Liangqiu Xiao Zhang, Liangqiu, Xiao Zhang. She had once stood at such a high position. She should have been the brightest star, but now she had to take over business matters. She must be exhausted. Yi Liangqiu used to act in literary films, so she didn't have much of a connection with money. Therefore, it was hard for people who didn't know her to imagine her doing business. The black RV drove steadily on the highway, and an hour later, they arrived at the Su mansion. "Mr. Yi, we're here." Xiao Zhang's voice was a bit soft. He had been sitting there for 5 minutes, but Mr. Yi didn't wake up, so he had to call him. Yi Liangqiu sat up straight. "We're here." Chapter 16-19. Xiao Zhang nodded and immediately got out of the car. He opened the door for her. "Mr. Yi, slow down. It just rained in B City." He picked up the phone again. "Don't forget your phone." Yi Liangqiu looked at it for a long time before picking up the phone. Xiao Zhang said goodbye to her, and she watched the car drive away. The phone in her hand vibrated. She was shocked and almost threw it away. It was a message from Qin Anlin. There were only a few words. "Where did you go?" Yi Liangqiu didn't reply because there was no need. She turned around and went upstairs. But that night, she didn't sleep well. In her dreams, he asked her, where did she go? Xia Mian's billboards were everywhere. She didn't sleep well that night. When she went to sign the contract on Monday afternoon, she didn't have much strength. Her eyes were even a little green. This time, Qin Anlin didn't bring Xia Mian with him. He only came with Kaim. The contract was quickly signed. The assistants of both parties packed up and left quickly, leaving the meeting room to Mr. Yi, President Qin. Yi Liangqiu wanted to leave, but Qin Anlin stopped her and said in a calm tone, "What's up in Hong Kong?" It seemed that he knew. Yi Liangqiu didn't avoid his eyes. She looked straight into his eyes and smiled. "Yes, I went to see Mr. Du. ATV wants to cooperate with Mr. Du's company." Qin Anlin's voice was slightly cold. "Do you know Du Yueshing's background?" "Yes." Yi Liangqiu said coldly. "Is President Qin worried about me? Then why did you provoke him?" Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. Are you crazy? She didn't say anything. She just looked at him quietly. Is ATV that important to you? Or is Su searching important to you? He tried to be calm, but found it difficult. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. If there's nothing else, President Qin, I'll leave first. She wanted to leave, but he immediately stood up and grabbed her hand. He looked at her with burning eyes. Aren't you going to ask me why I helped Ximian? Yi Liangqiu's body froze. She carried him for a while before she slowly turned around. She looked at him and sneered, You've done it. His fingers gripped her hand so tightly that it hurt. Suddenly, he let go of her hand. Yi Liangqiu, good job. Yi Liangqiu didn't get angry. Instead, she laughed. Didn't you want me to have such a reaction? Qin Anlin, you think you're great, but you're threatening me now. If I don't go back, you'll sleep with another woman, right? This was the first time in almost a year that they had argued so fiercely, and he had started it. Xia Mian became their cannon fodder. What if it is? He pulled her close and held her in his arms. He was so tall that she could only awkwardly look up at him. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and stomped hard on him. She had obviously used so much force, but he didn't even frown. Then sleep. She sneered. President Qin, do you want me to congratulate you? His face was livid. He had used so much force that he could almost break her in half. She still looked at him stubbornly. I find that you're still so hateful. He gritted his teeth and lowered his head to kiss her, but his face was full of disgust. Yi Liangqiu turned her face away and didn't let him kiss her. President Qin, don't kiss me with that mouth of yours. Even if you don't think it's dirty, I do. He froze for a moment and smiled even colder than her. Really? Why didn't you think it was disgusting when you climbed into my bed? He cupped her face, stared at her with narrowed eyes, and kissed her angrily again. Chapter 1620. In the end, she fell on the desk in embarrassment. Qin Anlin didn't touch her. He just squinted his eyes and carefully examined her. She also noticed it. She spat out one word angrily, pervert. It turned out that he was the one who was jealous. Qin Anlin took a few steps back and leisurely lit a cigarette. Put on your clothes, Mr. Yi. I'm not in the mood. She was still lying there and couldn't move for a long time. Qin Anlin leaned against the wall a few steps away. He blew out a smoke ring and looked at the person on the table with a slightly blurred gaze. She was embarrassed, but also the most seductive. Cut off contact with Du Yuexing, he said in a slightly domineering manner. Yi Liangqiu's fingers grabbed the edge of the table and slowly straightened her body. Then, she sat on the chair and tidied up her clothes. If I ask you not to support Xia Mian, will you? She looked at him. Qin Anlin, don't use those double standards on me. He smoked and frowned. Xia Mian was selected by herself. I didn't want to support her. Really? Who was the one who said that she couldn't stay in B City? Yi Liangqiu said in a stiff voice. After saying it, she also felt that it was meaningless to say it. Qin Anlin looked at her deeply. Do you care? I can expel her from B City right now. He looked straight into her eyes. Provided that you leave ATV and testify against Su Shiqing. Yi Liangqiu took out a cigarette box from her bag. She didn't usually smoke, so she was just pretending. As soon as she took out the cigarette, Qin Anlin pressed her hand and looked like a storm was brewing. You smoke. Yi Liangqiu, you're still in your adultery phase, aren't you? He grabbed her hand, his face full of anger. Yi Liangqiu turned her face away. No. But her face still quietly blushed. The crimson color spread from her cheeks to the back of her ears. It was extremely beautiful. Really? Qin Anlan's voice was hoarse. He bent down and hugged her from behind. His hands went to the front and easily restrained her. He rubbed her a few times to get the answer he wanted. After that, he was reluctant to let go, but he had no choice. But as soon as he let go, his body was hugged by her. Yi Liangqiu. He cried out and looked down at her. Yi Liangqiu held him with one hand and unbuttoned his shirt with the other. His black shirt was slightly open, but she only took a glance before buttoning it up for him again. What is this? His voice was slightly hoarse as he grabbed her fingers. His hands were almost trembling, and they were scorching hot. President Qin, consider it a gift. She also checked his body, and there was nothing suspicious. Qin Anlan was silent for about 2 seconds before he finally understood her intention. He took a step back, took her cigarette pack, rubbed it, and threw it into the trash can. Don't smoke anymore. Then he looked at her. Is Momo okay? She looked up and stared at him for a long time before saying softly, very good. Take a look at the photo, he said calmly. Then, he took her phone and opened it. He sent little Momo's photo to his phone, but he didn't ask to meet her. Yi Liangqiu clumsily buttoned up her shirt, but after buttoning it up, the shirt seemed a little small. His gaze swept over there and paused for a while before he said calmly, Mr. Yi, let's do this. You guys confirm the date of the release and inform us so that we can do the publicity. Chapter 1621. Qin Anlan left first, leaving Yi Liangqiu alone. Linda came in carefully. Seeing that Mr. Ye's hair was a little messy, Linda's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if Mr. Yi was hurt or not. Yi Liangqiu's voice was very calm. Wait for me outside. Linda nodded and left. After she left, Yi Liangqiu lowered his head and examined himself. She admitted that she had seduced Qin Anlan today. It wasn't because she wanted to have sex with him, but because she wanted to keep his heart. In the long years to come, she didn't know if he would be angry at her like he used to be. She wasn't afraid. She looked down, smiled, and slowly walked out. Because she was lonely, she deliberately didn't think about her birthday. On her 28th birthday, she worked overtime in the company until 8 o'clock. When she left, the road was still full of Xia Mian's billboards. Her phone rang. She stopped in front of a red light and took a look. It was a video message from Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi and Tang Yu were on vacation in France, but she still remembered her birthday and sent a video message to congratulate her. Liangqiu, I'll bring you the gift when I come back. Pei Chichi smiled sweetly. Behind her was the night view of Paris. Yi Liangqiu's eyes softened, and she silently said, thank you. She didn't go home directly. She had already fallen asleep. Her phone rang again, and it was Jia. Liangqiu, do you have time to come out for dinner? I just got off work. Jia sounded a little tired. Yi Liangqiu nodded, okay, I'll see you in half an hour. After hanging up, she turned the car around. When she arrived half an hour later, Jia was already there. She sat by the window and waited. When she saw Yi Liangqiu, she waved at her. Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu sat down. I didn't know if you were free, so I called you at the last minute. Jia smiled faintly. Yi Liangqiu shook her head. I'm not busy. Jia suddenly took out an exquisite box. Birthday present. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and looked up. There was surprise in her eyes. Jia smiled. No matter how old you are, you're still that 19-year-old girl. After that, he gestured for Yi Liangqiu to open the box. Inside was a crystal music box. The first movie Yi Liangqiu starred in was engraved with laser technology, and the music was the theme song. That's great. Yi Liangqiu looked up. Thank you, Ingjia. She knew that this was not cheap. It was custom-made and would cost at least 100,000. Ingjia smiled. What are you thanking me for? As long as you're happy. Let's take advantage of today and have some fun together. Yi Liangqiu looked at her for a long time before asking softly, Ingjia, have you been unhappy lately? Why not? Ingjia smiled. You're so silly. The waiter came over to serve the dishes. After the dishes were served, Ingjia started eating. I'm already in my 40s and there are many unhappy things. Usually, I go home alone and there's no one to talk to. Today is your birthday, but it's more like I'm looking for someone to accompany me. After that, she drank half a glass of aperitif. The golden liquid flowed down her throat. It was a little spicy, but Ingjia did not even frown. Yi Liangqiu looked at her and said softly, if you're lonely, find someone to accompany you. I won't. If it's not the one I want, there's no point in finding someone. Ingjia held on to the glass and laughed softly. Chapter 1622. Let's stop talking. Let's eat. Ingjia was also a straightforward person. She wouldn't be so gloomy all the time. Yi Liangqiu nodded and chatted happily, but they all skipped the topic of Qin Anlin. Although Xia Mian was under Ingjia's care, her heart was always on Yi Liangqiu's side. In the end, she hesitated for a moment and said, I know that you and President Qin haven't divorced. Look at that Xia Mian. She's not a law-abiding person. Yi Liangqiu didn't have anything to hide in front of her. She nodded and said, I know. There's nothing between President Qin and her. Ingjia sighed. Don't be too bad to him. Understand. Yi Liangqiu smiled bitterly. I know. Ingjia didn't mention it again. She wasn't a person who didn't know her limits. The two of them finished the meal in silence. At the end of the dessert, a small cake was magically given to them. After eating the cake, it'll be your birthday. Ingjia smiled. Yi Liangqiu felt a little warm in her heart. She made an exception and finished a small piece. When the two of them were about to leave, after passing through the long aisle, the door of a private room on the side opened. The sound coming from inside made her whole body tense up. It was Qin Anlin's voice. Then, the person inside walked out, not only him, but also little Mu Yun, who was holding little Mumu in her arms. When little Mumu was sent away, it was only a week old. Now, it had grown up. She could tell at a glance that it was her little Mumu. As for Mu Yun, she hadn't seen him for almost a year. It wasn't that she didn't want to, but that she didn't dare to. The air seemed to have frozen. She looked at her children, her red lips trembling slightly, and she couldn't say a word for a long time. Mom! Mu Yun rushed over, hugged her waist, and buried his little face in her arms. It was rare for this child to act like a spoiled child, but after not seeing her for a year, he missed his mother. Yi Liangqiu reached out and hugged her son. He had grown taller and stronger. It had been so long since she last saw him, but he was still so warm towards her. She felt extremely guilty, but she couldn't say it out loud. She reached out to rub the little fellow's hair and choked with emotion, Mu Yun. The little fellow snuggled in her arms for a long time. Suddenly, he raised his eyes and ran over to pick up little Mumu. He presented her to his mother and said fawningly, "This is my younger sister." He was clearly her child, but Yi Liangqiu actually felt a sense of fear. Little Mumu had been raised very well and could compete with Yi Liangqiu. At this time, she was also eating her fingers and blinking at Yi Liangqiu. Suddenly, little Mumu leaned over and kissed her. His saliva was all over her. The little fellow squeaked and laughed cheerfully. He looked like a lively child and was very similar to Momo. This was a little different from her. Perhaps Qin Anlin had been like this when he was young. Holding the little bun in her arms, Yi Liangqiu couldn't bear to put it down. Her face was pressed against little Mumu, and her eyes were a little warm. I heard from Jia that it's your birthday. Qin Anlin's voice was indifferent. What a coincidence. Yi Liangqiu looked up at him. Yes. A little hope rose in her heart. Did he specially ask her to meet the children on this day? Just as she was thinking about it, he interrupted her mercilessly. Mr. Yi, don't think too much. It's just a coincidence. After saying that, he hugged little Mumu and kissed him. Let's go home. Little Mumu lay on his shoulder and looked back at Yi Liangqiu. Little Mumu liked the fragrant smell on her body. Chapter 1623. This was the child that she had given birth to. It had only been a few days, and she had sent it away. Now that she saw it, she felt very sad and bitter. She wanted Qin Anlin to put the child down and let her see it more, but her throat seemed to be blocked and she couldn't say anything. Qin Anlin turned around and held little Mumu in his arms. He looked at Yi Liangqiu coldly, then lowered his head and looked at little Mumu. Little Mumu hugged his father with his chubby little hands and cried out twice. Then, he leaned softly into Qin Anlin's arms. He looked like a little white sheep and was extremely cute. Yi Liangqiu was a little envious and looked at him for a long time. Qin Anlin's face was pressed against the little sheep and he held the little guy up with his palm. The little guy cried out softly. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and her eyes became even hotter. To her, little Mumu was the best birthday present. Whether it was intentional or just a chance encounter, she was very happy. Her fingers gently touched little Mumu's fat calf. Mumu, you have to listen to Daddy. Qin Anlin glanced at her. I thought he didn't have a mother. He didn't move, nor did he have any intention of leaving. She paused for a long time before she realized that he wanted her to hug Mumu. Could she really? She carefully picked up little Mumu, afraid that the little guy wouldn't be willing. However, the little sheep was obedient and let her hug him. Yi Liangqiu knew that no matter how reluctant she was, she could only hug him for a while. Letting Mumu rely on her would only cause more harm to the child, so she returned Mumu to Qin Anlin after a while. Beside her, Qingxiu said indifferently, Young master, the car is already waiting. She didn't communicate with Yi Liangqiu at all. From the moment Yi Liangqiu stood on Su Shirqing's side, she was no longer her young madam. Yi Liangqiu could naturally feel Qingxiu's attitude. She naturally felt a little sad in her heart, but she only smiled. Qin Anlin didn't stay any longer. He turned around and left, with Crispy Sleeve following behind him. I'll steal my sister out in the future. Little Mu Yun's voice was low as he waved at Yi Liangqiu. He was only a 9-year-old child, but he was actually so sensible and experienced. Yi Liangqiu felt a little sad. She went forward to hug him and said softly, Mommy will be with Mu Yun in the future. Little Mu Yun nodded obediently. He had been raised by Yi Liangqiu since he was young, so he trusted his mother. I'll send you out to find your father. Yi Liangqiu turned around and nodded at Jia. Then, she personally sent little Mu Yun to the entrance of the hotel. A black Maybach was parked in front of the hotel. Qingxiu and little Mumu had already gotten into the car. Qin Anlin leaned against the door, obviously waiting for little Mu Yun. In the strong night wind, he leaned against the car door and smoked quietly. Yi Liangqiu approached and opened the door for little Mu Yun to get into the car. The door closed and she took 2 steps back. She was only 1 step away from him. Her voice was very soft. "Anyway, Anlin, thank you. I said it was a coincidence." Qin Anlin puffed out a smoke ring and said lightly. She looked at him deeply. "I'm leaving." When she turned around, her eyes were red. He walked forward step by step, using all of his strength. On a night like this, she wanted to hug him and feel his warmth. However, the only thing she could do was to leave him. Chapter 1624. Yi Liangqiu had some misgivings at first, but after a while, she smiled and said, "Okay." Ying Jia looked up at her boss again. Qin Anlin finished smoking the cigarette in his hand, glared at Ying Jia, and then got into the car. When he buckled his seatbelt and started the car, Su Xiu said, "Young master, are you still not going to forgive young madam?" Qin Anlin looked ahead intently. After a long time, he said softly, "There's no such thing as forgiveness." Su Xiu didn't understand what he meant, but she didn't dare to ask anymore. There was music in the car. After a while, Su Xiu said, "This is Miss Ya's song, right? It's quite nice." Qin Anlin didn't notice it at first, but now that he paid attention, he realized that it was true. Su Xiu continued, "Miss Ya is not bad. She cares about young master and takes care of young master and young Mississippi young master, you can consider her." Qin Anlin tightened his grip on the steering wheel. After a long time, he reminded her, "Aunt Sue, I'm not single. It's not a solution to keep dragging it on." Su Xiu said earnestly, "Young master can't always be single. I'm old too. In the future, someone has to take care of Mu Yun and Mu Mu. I'll take care of them myself. Don't mention this in the future." Although Qin Anlin's tone was indifferent, he was obviously unhappy. Su Xiu didn't say anything. She hugged Mu Mu and sighed. "The child is still young. You have to think more about him." Qin Anlin didn't reply. He first sent Su Xiu back to the old mansion, and then he took the 2 children back to the apartment. During the day, he sent the children to Su Xiu's place, but at night, he took care of them himself. This lasted for about half a year. It was very hard, but he stubbornly persisted. He stopped the car and asked Mu Yun to get out of the car by himself. He carried Mu Mu down. The little guy was asleep, and it was very comfortable to hold him. The chubby little ball was lying in his arms. Qin Anlin lowered his head and kissed his little daughter. His eyes were filled with gentleness. Holding his little daughter in one hand and little Mu Yun in the other, he arrived at the apartment and turned on the lights. When the lights were on, Qin Anlin's eyes fell on the sofa. It was empty, but he longed for someone to sit there, someone who would never appear. She lowered her eyes and smiled. "I'm home." Little Mu Yun carried little Mu Mu from his arms. It was quite strenuous for her to carry him. Qin Anlin went to turn on the bathwater. Poor little Mu Mu was woken up by Papa and his brother. He opened his big cute eyes, looked at the bubbles around him, and burst into tears. Little Mu Yun squatted down and helped her father bathe the little fellow. She was like a little cow, very cute. Just like that little milkshake bun. Therefore, before the little yellow bun appeared, he was willing to take care of his sister. Little Mu Mu cried for a long time, but when she realized that it was useless, she looked at her papa with her big tear-filled eyes. The baby was only 6 months old. Mu Mu's hair was thin yellow. It was cute and funny. Qin Anlin smiled, picked up a towel and began to bathe his little daughter. Mu Yun didn't play with the little sheep anymore, so he went to take a bath. Qin Anlin smiled. He picked up a towel and began to bathe his little daughter. Little Muyun didn't have the little sheep to play with, so she obediently went to bathe herself. After washing the baby, he carried her to the bedroom with a towel. The little girl slept with him, while Muyun slept by himself. After washing the baby, he carried her to the bedroom with a towel. The little girl slept with him, while Muyun slept by himself. He put the little girl on the bed and wiped her dry with a towel. The little girl rolled on the bed happily. Chapter 1625. The corners of Qin Anlin's mouth curled up slightly as he lowered his head and kissed the little girl's belly. It smelled so good. He helped little Mumu put on the onesie and then carried her to the kitchen. He carried the baby in one hand and quickly made milk powder with the other. His movements were so skillful that it was as if he had practiced it thousands of times. As soon as little Mumu smelled it, she sucked greedily. Qin Anlin carried her to the bedroom and lay on her side, letting the little girl lie in his arms. Her two chubby little hands held the bottle and she ate happily. She had been eating milk powder since she was young, so she was very satisfied. It wasn't that Qin Anlin couldn't find a nanny for her, but he just didn't want to. Little Mumu drank more than half a bottle and was sleepy. Her eyelids were fighting. She held the bottle and drank 2 mouthfuls, then let go. After a while, she held the bottle and drank 2 more mouthfuls in a daze. Finally, her little face tilted and the bottle slipped from her hand. The little guy squeezed into Qin Anlin's embrace and placed a small hand on his Xiong's chest. Every single fingernail on that chubby little hand was pink, especially the fingernails. They were all clean. Qin Anlin lowered his head and looked at her. He couldn't get tired of looking at her. Although he was angry with Yi Liangqiu, he loved this child very much. If he had to choose between Momo and little Mumu, he would rather have little Mumu by his side. Momo was a boy, and little Mumu was so fragile and small. He sighed and couldn't help but think of Momo. She was also his child. How could he not think of her? After taking a shower, Yi Muyun came in wearing a bathrobe. After running in, he climbed onto the bed and said, "I'll take care of Mumu." Qin Anlin kissed his son. This child was so sensible that it made his heart ache. He gently let go of little Mumu and Yi Muyun quickly replaced him. But a tragedy happened. Little Mumu woke up with a start and opened his eyes blankly. Then, he subconsciously went to look for his milk bottle. He didn't find the milk bottle and instead bit his brother. Yi Muyun was helpless. Mumu. But little Mumu couldn't care less. He quickly took 2 bites and didn't eat anything. Cry, cry, cry. Yi Muyun quickly stuffed the bottle into her mouth. Qin Anlin smiled and walked into the bathroom with his clothes. When he came out, the 2 little ones were asleep, their heads leaning against each other. Little Mumu even put one of his fat legs on little Muyun's waist. Qin Anlin covered the children with the quilt and looked at them quietly for a long time. Then, he turned around and went out to the living room. Sitting on the sofa in front of the French window, he poured himself a glass of wine. The night was just right, but he didn't feel sleepy. Now, she was drinking with Jia. Would he be drunk? Would he have an accident on his way back? Qin Anlin took the phone and put his finger on it for a long time, but he didn't make the call. What was this? She had nothing to do with him. Why did he have to worry about her so much? After a long time, he put down the phone and sat there, sipping the red wine and looking at the night sky. It wasn't until 2:00 in the morning that his phone rang. It was Jia's phone call. He picked up almost immediately. It was a young man's voice. "Sir, we're at night bar. There are 2 ladies here who are drunk and haven't paid the bill. We're going to fake it. Night bar. Drunk to death. Haven't paid the bill. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.